So this is ICAC Unpacked. I'm Norman Michaelation. Here's the second article I want to talk about. Mostly on this channel, I deal with the stings and collateral issues like the registry. But I've been known to talk about how the media has dealt with, or rather failed to deal with, these issues, how politicians have been craven and cowardly in dealing with people who are victims, who are adults who did not intend to do anything with children, weren't looking for that kind of assignation. But there's more to it. Lately, I've been hearing on my channel here that some people have suggested that erroneously that we are spending too much money paying for people to be in prison who particularly committed sex offense or murder or whatever their little issue is that they want to solve by simply killing people. All right. That's the solution all the time. If we just killed these people, we wouldn't have this problem. Of course, they carve out all sorts of interesting exceptions for themselves, for relatives of theirs. I mean, there's a certain group in this country, a political party, which is very much anti-abortion until it happens to someone in their family. Then they rush quietly to an abortion center in a state that allows it and quietly get their little abortion. We've seen this over and over and over again. Hypocrisy is certainly not a monopoly. We've seen it on both sides, but it's particularly in one particular political party here in the United States. But I'm not really even talking about political parties. Let's talk about the idea that prisons cost us a lot of money caused by prisoners, and what we need to do is charge the prisoners more. Well, as I pointed out already, we incarcerate more than the top 10 industrialized nations in the world here in the United States. And in Virginia, where I live, we incarcerate the largest share of them by proportion. And I don't have those statistics in front of me. You have to look at other videos I've done or look at the Prison Policy Institute. They have some great statistics on the subject. The Pew Research Center has great stats. The Vera Institute is another one, and the Cato Institute is yet another. So you can look into these things. You don't have to take my word for it. But you'll see very often that there is an exploitative element in the prisons that most people would be surprised to learn. You want prisoners to pay the price? Sure, they already pay it. You have to pay court costs, restitution. Very often they won't let you out of prison unless you pay those costs, prison or jail. Well, you have to get a job, and of course, if you have a felony, that precludes you from working. Not only do companies not want to hire you, but there's a list of various professions that you're barred from. In Virginia, it's a 5-page list called crimes list. That's what it's called. The barrier crimes list of needed occupations that we don't have people doing, including things like assistant in a nursing home. It's this hysteria that we talk about on this channel that pervades all of it. Okay. So I want to show you this article where you hear once again where people are being overcharged. I've already talked about the commissary, which is the place that you can go to get things that you often need when you're in prison or jails, like long underwear because it's freezing cold in there, toothbrushes. This is dental floss you can't get. I would use, and other people would use little strands from your linens that you would use to do your teeth. If you want to get a pen to write a letter, or paper, or an envelope, you have to order those. They're not given out to you, folks. Okay? If you wanted to get deodorant, if you wanted to get baby powder, if you use that as a deodorant, mouthwash, which is shitty, but you can get all these things at a price. And if you don't have anybody to put money on your commissary card or on your account, you don't have access to it. And then you have the defective mechanics inside the building where if you're trying to make a phone call out, you get maybe one or two phone calls after you've been arrested, but the directions that they give you don't work. And if I hadn't had somebody who knew this, it would have cost me dearly. They give you a card that doesn't work. The directions are wrong. And you end up losing your two free phone calls because what they give you is incorrect. I mean, we can go on the abuses, but this is one of the greatest abuses. People don't realize that prisons here in Virginia and elsewhere, they have prisoners making things like desks and furniture and things like that, which the state sells at a profit. And they pay people pennies of 50, 68 cents, 72 cents an hour to assemble these things, well below the minimum wage. Virginia just added a minimum wage that will get us up to $15 an hour by January 1, 2026, and everybody celebrates. But don't forget that the people who work some of the hardest, longest hours under the most grueling conditions with no air conditioning are prisoners in prisons, not only here in Virginia, across the United States, and they get 58 cents, 68 cents an hour, as I said. They also get crappy food. So here's an article which shows you how they've been further exploited. I've talked about a Geo Group, for example, and others running the phone call services, okay, where you charge exorbitant rates and you have to talk very fast or you have to be quick. And this is very awful when you have gangs in prisons that are running the phones and the correction officers do not put a stop to it, or they're afraid to put a stop to it because, after all, nobody wants to work in prisons either, much less be a police officer, according to the police, that is. And so you don't get the best people in these places. You get often cruel, heartless, vicious people who are corrections officers. Not universally. I ran into some wonderful ones. People who said to me, "Why are you even here? You don't belong here." To which I responded, "If you open the door, I'll gladly leave." Well, among the many abuses is food service. And we have had cases where corrupt officials have ordered things like steak and lobster and everything come into the facility, which they have taken home for themselves and ordered crappy things. I remember eating watermelon and other things which were almost rancid, pieces of meat which were basically gristle and useless. Okay. And the only thing worthwhile were beans, which are very, very nutritious. But you get those in a very small proportion versus rice and other sorts of things. In other words, they make a lot of money on feeding people in prisons and jails, and very often the food is substandard. So I want to show you this article that came out of the Appeal, which is a fine news organization. It is independent. I urge you to support it. They do a lot of coverage, they do more coverage of issues like what's going on in prisons and abuse by police and abuse by the government than a lot of other agencies out there. And they cover things that most people do not cover. Also, I would urge you to, if you're going to spend a few nickels, the Prison Journalism Project, PJP, which is done by prisoners. They run this. I tried to get something like this going and support it through the Northern Virginia Community College System office when I was head of briefly coordinator of education services for the Northern Virginia Community College System, working with the DOC and with the 29 colleges until they ran me out of there because they didn't like dealing with somebody who was an actual a felon, but formerly incarcerated for a sex offense that I did not create, that didn't matter to them. They circled me like sharks, a wounded animal, and made sure that they made my life living hell for the 8 months I was working there. So you see here, prison dining giant Aramark serves inedible food to drive commissary sales, lawsuit alleges. So this is a lawsuit by West Virginia inmates and their their family members, arguing that they're charged high price for fresh produce and snacks in the commissary if they can even get them. They're very often not available. And these are causing all sorts of problems. Remember, you're serving people trashy food, which increases illnesses, which increases issues involving anything from insulin resistance to other chronic conditions that can come as a result of it. I ended up being diagnosed with plantar fasciitis when I was in there. My back issues were exacerbated. And a lot of this cleared up when I left there. Now, the one good thing I would say about it is that it allowed me to work out a lot more because I was bored and I lost 10 pounds. So I was perhaps in the best shape I had been in 10 years. But I wouldn't trade that for good quality food, nutrition, healthcare, which is dubious at best, and other poor aspects of prison life. Okay. Of course, Aramark is fighting back. Aramark is the so-called food service. By the way, Aramark will have one or two people who are Aramark people working at the prison, but the actual cooks are actual prisoners. And by the way, if you've been convicted of a sex offense, they don't let you anywhere near the kitchen. They don't let you anywhere you can't tutor, you can't be on these, even in these gangs that make furniture and stuff. Anything where you would be among the general population for a long period of time. I was allowed to work temporarily in the law library, which was useful to me because I was looking up important issues regarding my case and advising others about their cases. And my advice was able to help many people along the way, at least give them an understanding of what they were up against because they couldn't necessarily understand it based on their limited education. A lot of these people in prisons and jails. Okay. Um, Aramark brought in $18.5 billion in revenue, so you think they could certainly do better. But of course, Aramark is trying to dismissed the lawsuit simply saying these are prisoners, you can't trust them. Same thing they always say, they're prisoners, you can't trust them. The police say that, the courts say that, everybody says that. You can't trust these people. They are prisoners. They're prisoners for a reason after all, right? They're felons. You can't believe a word they say. So easy to dismiss these complaints when in fact you have to understand that the people who would know about this stuff are prisoners. The people who should be on parole boards and prison boards and on committees dealing with this sort of thing, legislative committees, are the very people who have been there. Why aren't more of them on these committees and advising lawmakers on what's actually going on in there? You see, this at best, plaintiffs' allegations establish they're dissatisfied with their food in prison. This is a far cry from establishing the type of life or death deprivation of basic needs upon which plaintiffs' theory depends. Well, I can tell you the food is shitty, okay? More often than you realize, and in West Virginia, perhaps worse than other places. Of course, they're arguing under the plaintiffs, that is, the state's consumer protection law is what's being violated here. And I will post this in the the description below here so you can read it yourself. I'm sorry, I'm not 100%, so I'll end the video there. But just goes to show you, for those of you out there thinking that prisoners don't pay enough price to society and that they have to pay even more and it's costing taxpayers. Well, you can solve that problem by following the recommendations of the organizations who do research on this and come up with other solutions for low-level recidivist people who are in prisons and jails. Uh, Allow people who are those 25% or so waiting for their day in court to prove their innocence, let them out. That would save you money. You could allow a more generous way for them to pay their so-called court costs. That would be helpful instead of rearresting them. If they owe child support, insisting that they work, helping them find a job, and garnishing a smaller portion so that they could actually get on their feet, or on some graduated scale where the longer they work, the more is taken out to support their children because it does no good to put them in jail where they can't earn any money at all. There's a variety of things that they could do to make things better for all concerned, but of course, they won't. But one of the things that we could certainly do is provide a living wage, provide a means to get on your feet when you're in prison, provide a means to get good nutrition so that you're not sick. There are people who are worse off than me because they started worse off. Thank God I went in healthy. But we need to have a better system in this country that has such great wealth and affords itself the luxury of thinking that it's far better than the rest of the world, when in fact we aren't in so many important ways.